The folder on the mahogany desk was thick, bound in twine that looked ready to snap. It was labeled "Secret," stamped in red ink that had started to fade into a dull, dried blood rust. Outside the window, the New York skyline was a jagged set of teeth biting into the gray underbelly of a winter sky. Inside the office, the radiator hissed, a serpentine sound that seemed to mock the three men sitting in the room. One was the police commissioner, one was the mayor, and the third chair was empty. They weren't waiting for a suspect, they weren't waiting for a lawyer, they were waiting for a solution to a problem that had kept them awake for 6 straight nights. The city was vibrating, not with the usual hum of commerce, but with a low-frequency tremor of impending violence. The streets of Harlem were too quiet. It was the silence of a held breath before a scream. The commissioner lit a cigarette, his hands betraying a slight, almost imperceptible tremor. He had 5,000 uniformed officers at his disposal. He had tear gas, batons, and the full weight of the penal code, and he knew, with terrifying certainty, that none of it mattered. The door didn't slam open. There was no announcing shout from a secretary. The handle simply turned. The man who walked in didn't look like a threat. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than the commissioner made in a year, tailored so perfectly it seemed to move with him like a second skin. He didn't take off his hat immediately. He scanned the room, his eyes taking the measure of the men, the fear, the files, and the future, all in a single heartbeat. He didn't sit in the empty chair. He walked to the window and looked out at the city that wanted him dead, yet needed him alive. The mayor cleared his throat to speak, to assert authority, to remind this intruder of the hierarchy. But the words died in his throat, because in that room, surrounded by the emblems of the state, the man by the window held the only currency that mattered. He held the peace, and he was about to sell it to them at a price they couldn't refuse. If you're drawn to the untold power stories of Harlem and the men who ruled without noise, you're already in the right place. This is Bumpy Johnson Files. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. The official narrative is a clean, straight line. The police are the hunters, the criminals are the prey, the courts are the arbiters of justice, and the prison cell is the inevitable conclusion for those who break the law. That is the story they teach in the academy. That is the story they print in the papers. But the file on the desk that day, the file that was never archived in the public records, tells a different story. It tells the story of a terrifying compromise. History has tried to bury the fact that for nearly 40 years, the city of New York didn't just fail to stop the man called Bumpy. They actively decided not to. They erased the meetings in parked cars. They shredded the memos that advised containment rather than eradication. They want you to believe they were outsmarted. The truth is far more unsettling. They were outmanaged. This isn't a story about a master criminal escaping the law. This is the story of how the law looked into the abyss of chaos, saw what a world without a king looked like, and decided that a controlled devil was better than an unleashed demon. But before we understand the politics of this surrender, we have to understand the burden of the man who forced it. We imagine power as a kind of freedom, the ability to do what you want when you want. But for him, power was a cage. Imagine waking up every morning knowing that the livelihood of an entire neighborhood, the tuition of 100 children, and the safety of 10,000 souls rested on your ability to remain calm. He wasn't a sociopath. He wasn't a man who enjoyed pain. He was a man who felt the crushing weight of expectation. He walked the streets not with the swagger of a bully, but with the heavy, deliberate gait of a man carrying water uphill. He saw the poverty, he saw the desperation, he saw how easily a young boy could turn into a killer if there wasn't a structure to guide him. He knew that without him, the ecosystem of the underworld wouldn't disappear, it would just rot, it would become feral. The vulnerability he hid behind his sunglasses was a deep, gnawing fear of the vacuum. He knew what happened when a king fell. He had seen the localized apocalypses that occurred when a bloc lost its leader. The looting, the random violence, the predation of the weak. He realized early on that he wasn't just running a numbers racket or a distribution network. He was the infrastructure. He was the bank, the judge, and the police force in a place where the actual banks wouldn't lend and the actual police wouldn't protect. The moral struggle wasn't about breaking the law, it was about whether he could bear the sin of ruling so that others could have the luxury of living. For years, the establishment didn't see him. To the downtown power brokers, Harlem was a blur, a distant colony that only mattered during election years. They didn't know his name. They only knew the effects of his presence. They noticed that in certain precincts, the petty crime rate dropped to zero. They noticed that while other boroughs were plagued by disorganized gang wars, Uptown had a rhythm. It was efficient. It was quiet. They heard whispers from their beat cops. Officers would come back to the station house, shaking their heads, talking about a dispute that should have ended in a double homicide, but was settled with a conversation in a barber shop. They talked about a professor who handed out logic instead of bullets. They realized that the streets were self-regulating. The police commanders, men of pride and ego, initially took credit for this. They pinned medals on their own chests, congratulating themselves on their effective strategies. They didn't realize they were just guests in someone else's house. But as the years turned, the silence became impossible to ignore. The man in the shadows began to take shape. He wasn't loud. He didn't wear the flashy colors of the pimps or the desperate hustlers. He dressed like a banker. He read Nietzsche and history. He played chess. The realization crept into the DA's office like a cold draft. They weren't dealing with a thug. They were dealing with a CEO. And the corporation he ran was too big to fail. The tension began to escalate when the ambitious man arrived. Every few years, a new prosecutor or a new police captain would come to Harlem, hungry for a headline. They viewed the existing stability as corruption. They saw the quiet and called it complicity. They wanted to make a name for themselves by taking down the giant. One such captain arrived in the mid-50s. He was young, rigid, and believed in the absolute letter of the law. He didn't care about the ecosystem. He only cared about the statutes. He launched a campaign of zero tolerance. He kicked down doors. He harassed the bagmen. He arrested the grandmothers who held the policy slips. He disrupted the flow. What he didn't know was that he was pulling the pins out of a grenade he couldn't see. Within 2 weeks of this new crusade, the order broke. But it didn't break in the way the captain expected. Bumpy didn't fight back. He didn't order hits on police officers. He didn't ambush patrols. He simply withdrew. He stepped back. He sent word to his lieutenants to stand down. He let the natural entropy of the streets take over. Without the central authority, the vacuum was filled instantly. Freelancers moved in. Desperate junkies started robbing grocery stores. Disputes over territory, once settled in back rooms, spilled out onto the sidewalks with switchblades and zip guns. The robbery rate spiked by 400% in a month. Bodies started turning up in alleyways, unrelated to organized crime, just victims of the sudden anarchy. The young captain was overwhelmed. His phone rang off the hook. The local pastors, the business owners, even the innocent civilians were screaming for help. They weren't asking for more police, they were asking where the order had gone. The captain had destroyed the immune system of the neighborhood, and now the infection was spreading. The tension began to escalate when the ambitious man arrived. Every few years, a new prosecutor or a new police captain would come to Harlem, hungry for a headline. They viewed the existing stability as corruption. They saw the quiet and called it complicity. They wanted to make a name for themselves by taking down the giant. One such captain arrived in the mid-50s. He was young, rigid, and believed in the absolute letter of the law. He didn't care about the ecosystem. He only cared about the statutes. He launched a campaign of zero tolerance. He kicked down doors. He harassed the bagmen. He arrested the grandmothers who held the policy slips. He disrupted the flow. What he didn't know was that he was pulling the pins out of a grenade he couldn't see. Within 2 weeks of this new crusade, the order broke. But it didn't break in the way the captain expected. Bumpy didn't fight back. He didn't order hits on police officers. He didn't ambush patrols. He simply withdrew. He stepped back. He sent word to his lieutenants to stand down. He let the natural entropy of the streets take over. Without the central authority, the vacuum was filled instantly. Freelancers moved in. Desperate junkies started robbing grocery stores. Disputes over territory, once settled in back rooms, spilled out onto the sidewalks with switchblades and zip guns. The robbery rate spiked by 400% in a month. Bodies started turning up in alleyways, unrelated to organized crime, just victims of the sudden anarchy. The young captain was overwhelmed. His phone rang off the hook. The local pastors, the business owners, even the innocent civilians were screaming for help. They weren't asking for more police, they were asking where the order had gone. The captain had destroyed the immune system of the neighborhood, and now the infection was spreading. The pressure on Bumpy was immense. The Italians had more money, more guns, and deeper political connections. They wanted him to be a puppet, a figurehead who would open the gates and let the floodwaters in. If he refused, they threatened war. If he agreed, he would destroy his own people. This was the moment of the hardest choice. The police knew the Italians were moving in. They knew that if the 5 families took full control of Harlem, the violence would be catastrophic. The Italians didn't care about the community. They only cared about the extraction of wealth. They would burn the neighborhood down to find a nickel in the ashes. The authorities found themselves in a bizarre, twisted position. To keep the peace, they needed Bumpy Johnson to win. They needed the local warlord to hold off the foreign invaders. The FBI files from this era are filled with redacted reports, agents observing meetings between Bumpy and Genovese representatives, noting the tension, noting the threats, and surprisingly, noting that they did not intervene to help the Italians. They delayed the payoff. The war was brewing. The air was thick with the promise of violence. Everyone expected a bloodbath. The press was ready for the headlines. Gangland war erupts in Harlem. The police braced for overtime. But Bumpy slowed the pacing. He didn't go to the mattresses. He used the weapon the police had inadvertently given him, his legitimacy. He knew the police preferred his stability over the Italians' chaos. He sent a back-channel message to the precinct commanders. He let them know where the Italian stash houses were. He let them know when the shipments were coming in from the docks, shipments that belonged to his rivals. He weaponized the law against his enemies. The police, eager for the busts and happy to weaken the Italian expansion, struck hard. They raided the Genovese operations, they confiscated kilos of product, they arrested the Italian soldiers. The twist was quiet, dominant, and psychological. Bumpy sat in the Palmetto bar drinking coffee while the sirens wailed past him, heading toward his enemies. He hadn't fired a shot. He hadn't broken a treaty. He had simply aligned his interests with the state's interests. He showed the Italians that Harlem wasn't just territory, it was a fortress, and the police were unwittingly manning the walls for him. The Italians retreated. They realized they couldn't fight a two-front war against Bumpy's organization and a police force that seemed to have a supernatural knack for finding their operations. They came to the table. They negotiated. They accepted Bumpy as an equal partner, not a subordinate. The event turned into a legend. The story wasn't just that Bumpy beat the mob, it was that he had tamed the law. Word spread through the barber shops and the pool halls that the man was untouchable not because he was invisible, but because he was essential. The young hustlers looked at him with awe, not just for his toughness, but for his intellect. He had turned the very force designed to destroy him, the police, into his personal enforcement arm. It permanently changed the rules. It established a precedent that would last for decades. The police would tolerate the hierarchy as long as the hierarchy contained the chaos. It was an unholy alliance, a marriage of convenience between the badge and the outlaw. It was cynical, it was corrupt, and it was undeniably effective. But the cost of such power is isolation. In the end, as he aged, Bumpy understood the fragility of what he had built. He knew that stability based on one man is a temporary illusion. He sat on that park bench in his final years, looking at the cracks in the pavement, knowing that the moment he was gone, the deal would be broken. The police would forget the utility and remember only the law. The young wolves would forget the discipline and remember only the greed. The philosophical truth he left behind is heavy. We like to think that society is held together by laws, by constitutions, by the clear moral lines of right and wrong. But the truth, the one that history tries to bury, is that society is often held together by the monsters we agree to tolerate. We let them operate because the alternative, true unbridled chaos, is too terrifying to contemplate. We trade justice for order, we trade righteousness for peace, and we pretend that the man in the charcoal suit is the enemy, while secretly praying that he never leaves his post. Stability, it turns out, is the most expensive luxury of all, and sometimes the only people rich enough to pay for it are the ones we call criminals. This is Bumpy Johnson Files. Subscribe for the stories history tried to bury.